That evening, as autumn leaves, like rusty coins, swirled in a whimsical dance beneath the dim glow of Tokyo's streetlights, young Akira Kawamura's world was forever changed. She was only 16, leading the life of a typical Japanese high school girl, diligently attending classes, spending time with friends, and making plans for the future. But the cold, piercing wind that swept through the narrow alleys of Shinjuku carried away not only the fading foliage, but also Akira herself. That day, as usual, Akira had stayed after school, engrossed in her extracurricular activities. She loved to draw. Her artwork always stood out with its exquisite beauty and a delicate understanding of the world. She was a dreamer, fragile as a porcelain doll, yet incredibly strong, determined, with burning eyes and unwavering self-belief. Her slender fingers trembled as they touched the paper, bringing forth amazing images, full of life and emotion. Finally, after saying goodbye to her teacher and classmates, Akira left the school building, feeling a light thrill in anticipation of seeing her family soon. She headed towards the nearest subway station, looking forward to the short ride home. Home was very close, only a few stops away. But that evening, filled with mystery, Akira never returned to her warm, cozy home. When the sun had already vanished beyond the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, Akira's parents, worried about her late return, began to panic, feeling a chilling fear creep into their hearts. Their daughter was always punctual, and any delays were usually preceded by a warning. But Akira's phone was silent, out of service. The mother's heart, sensitive and intuitive, was torn by a premonition of trouble. The father, clenching his teeth and gathering all his willpower, began calling everyone he knew: friends, acquaintances, hospitals. But nowhere was there any news. The police, having received the report of the disappearance, began an investigation. But the first few hours, days, seemed to bring no results. In Japan, where the crime rate was one of the lowest in the world, the disappearance of a person was an extraordinary event, especially when it concerned a young person. The whole city was awash in flyers with Akira's photograph. Her name was repeated in the news again and again. Volunteers formed search parties, ready to comb through every corner. It seemed the entire nation, holding its breath, lived on a single hope for a miracle. Tokyo in those days was engulfed in an atmosphere of anxiety and despair, causing hearts to beat in unison, awaiting news. The streets, usually bustling with life, now appeared deserted and grim. Each evening, as darkness descended upon the city, fear crept into people's souls. Parents held their children tightly, trying not to let them out of their sight, and friends were afraid to be separated even for a short time. Akira's disappearance became a bitter reminder to everyone of how fleeting and fragile human life is, and the danger could lurk even in the safest place. Days passed, and hope dwindled with every passing minute. The investigation seemed to have reached a dead end. Day after day, the police questioned witnesses, meticulously reviewed recordings from numerous surveillance cameras, but all was in vain. Not a single clue. There were no signs of a struggle, not even a hint of abduction. Akira seemed to have vanished into the night air. But then, one day, after 3 weeks had passed since her tragic disappearance, an unexpected turn of events occurred, altering the course of the case forever. In a forgotten suburb of Tokyo, within a grim, abandoned warehouse, the police discovered a body. At first glance, It seemed like another sad case, but when the experts began their examination, they realized they were confronted with something truly horrific. The body belonged to Akira Kawamura. The circumstances surrounding her death were so brutal and elaborate that even the most seasoned investigators were shocked to their core. Numerous marks of violence were found on the lifeless body of the young woman, clearly indicating that she had endured unimaginable torture. Everything suggested that she had been abducted, held captive, and tormented before her life was taken. This nightmarish act of violence shook Japan to its foundations. In a land where murder was exceedingly rare and violence against women was considered an absolute taboo, this tragedy shocked everyone. People couldn't believe such a thing could happen in their peaceful, safe town, where not a single similar crime had been registered in the past 20 years. A new investigation began, and the police were now determined to find the killer and uncover all the details of this monstrous crime. The honor and reputation of the country, as well as the peace of its citizens, were at stake. The investigation commenced a meticulous search for evidence at the scene of the horrific crime. The abandoned warehouse, harboring grim secrets, was thoroughly examined. Here, amidst the dust and dimness, objects were discovered that could shed light on the identity of the brutal killer. Investigators, like hunters, scrutinized every corner, studying every inch of the space, searching for the smallest clues that could lead to the solution. It was obvious that the crime had been carefully planned, every detail thought out. The killer clearly knew what they were doing, and judging by the evidence, was very familiar with the area where this tragedy had occurred. The police immediately began reviewing surveillance footage, attempting to reconstruct Akira's route on that fateful day. Investigators were eager to identify any suspicious individuals who might have been involved in this terrible affair. Soon, like a thread pulled from a tangled ball, the investigators found themselves following the trail of a man named Kazuo Ito. Ito, a local resident who worked at the warehouse where Akira's body had been discovered, was summoned for questioning. His initial statements seemed plausible enough, but during the interrogation, the investigators began to notice inconsistencies in his story. He was constantly nervous, got mixed up in details, his voice trembled, and his gaze avoided eye contact, betraying his anxiety. When the investigators presented Ito with undeniable evidence of his involvement in the heinous crime, he crumbled, his steel nerves faltered, and he confessed to the murder of Akira. Ito, with his head bowed, recounted how he had stalked Akira, how he had kidnapped her like prey and held her captive in the gloomy, abandoned warehouse where perpetual twilight reigned. He described his motives in detail, twisted and monstrous, as if he was spilling out all the accumulated pain and rage. According to him, it all began with personal problems and a deep, corrosive feeling of hatred towards women. Ito's motives were as horrifying as the crime itself. He suffered from profound psychological disorders, born from a harsh, deprived childhood and a string of fatal failures in his personal life. He took out his anger on an innocent young woman who became for him nothing more than a defenseless victim, an object for the satisfaction of his most depraved fantasies. The trial of Kazuo Ito became one of the most high-profile and sensational in the history of Japan. In the courtroom, where many witnesses and journalists were present, a stifling, tense atmosphere reigned. Akira's family, unable to hold back their tears, listened with horror to the chilling confessions of the murderer, every word of which like a knife, cut into their wounded hearts. The public, holding its breath, followed each court session, yearning for justice. The verdict sounded like a sentence. Ito was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. After the announcement of the verdict, it was time for deep reflection. How could such a thing happen? What led to this horrific tragedy? The answers proved complex and ambiguous, like a labyrinth where each turn presented new questions. Akira's death served as a bitter reminder that evil lurks, capable of hiding in the most unassuming corners of life. It, like a relentless spotlight, illuminated the issues surrounding violence against women and exposed the need for more effective measures to protect those who had become victims of cruelty. But most tragically, Akira's death left an unhealing scar in the hearts of her loved ones, her loyal friends, and all who wholeheartedly empathized with her tragic fate. This tragedy reminded us of the enduring importance of compassion, mutual support, and the necessity for each of us to be vigilant and care for one another to prevent the recurrence of such nightmares in the future. However, the story we tell does not end here. This is merely the outline of the case, its outer shell. The true depth lies in the details, in the psychological portraits, in the ominous atmosphere that shrouded this tragedy. Let's journey back to that autumn evening when Akira vanished without a trace. Let's try to picture her final hours, the moments preceding the terrible end. We know she was a gifted artist, a dreamy and incredibly kind young woman. She loved to create colorful flowers on canvas, paint portraits of her friends, and depict the picturesque landscapes of Tokyo. Her artwork was always distinguished by a special tenderness and some unfathomable depth. Akira made plans for the future. She dreamed of going to university, traveling the world, inspired by new places and people, and, of course, becoming a famous artist whose name would be on everyone's lips. She built castles in the air, cherishing dreams and making plans for the future. But all these hopes, bright as the summer sun, were cut short on that terrible evening. We must remember her aspirations, her talent, as bright as a flash of lightning, and her short, but such a valuable life. We must remember her to understand the nature of evil and to do everything in our power to ensure such a tragedy never happens again. There were many mysteries in this case, like a labyrinth filled with secrets. Why did Ito choose Akira out of all people? What really happened in that abandoned warehouse, shrouded in darkness and silence? What was Akira feeling in her final hours as her life faded away? But perhaps the most complex question, one that continues to haunt us to this day, remains the question of the criminal's motives. Why did he commit this monstrous act? What drove him to this horrific deed? These questions may never be answered completely, but we can try to understand, to delve into the darkest corners of the human soul, to attempt to see the world through the eyes of the one who committed the crime. Kazuo Ito was born into a family plagued by misfortune. His father, broken by life, succumbed to alcohol. His mother, exhausted by back-breaking labor, vanished into work from morning until late evening. Kazuo endured repeated abuse and humiliation during his childhood. He grew up alone, withdrawn, and embittered towards the world. During his school years, he didn't have a single friend. Classmates constantly teased him, tormenting him and making his life unbearable. He was an outcast, rejected by society. As time passed, this alienation only entrenched hatred within his heart, spreading like poisonous ivy. An obsessive idea of revenge took hold of him, eating away at his soul like acid. Seeking solace, or perhaps driven by a desire to further damage himself, he turned to pornography. In these films, women were reduced to soulless objects of violence, stripped of their voices. His inflamed mind conjured a twisted image of the world, where women were to blame for all his misfortunes, for all his troubles, as if they were the cause of his personal suffering. Then, one day, fate brought him to Akira. In her, he saw the embodiment of everything he so fiercely hated. She was beautiful, talented, full of life, and genuinely happy. She was the complete opposite of him, hideous in spirit, embittered, and alone. Like a predator stalking its prey, Ito began to follow Akira. He meticulously studied her schedule, memorized her every route, and delved into her habits, all to get closer to carry out his vile plan. He gathered information about this girl just as a predator stalks its quarry. That evening, as the sun was already beginning to descend towards the horizon, he ambushed Akira at the school doors. With a sudden motion, he seized her, shoved her into the old weathered car, and sped away toward the abandoned warehouse, where he hoped she would finally break. There, in the musty half-light of the forgotten building, his tortures began. He tormented her, seeking to destroy her will, to erase the last vestiges of hope. He wanted her to feel all the pain, all the suffering that he himself had endured. He wanted to see her collapse, broken, humiliated. But Akira did not yield. She resisted to the end, desperately clinging to life. Her screams ripped through the silence, mingling with tears, as she pleaded for mercy, hoping that even in his hardened heart, a single drop of compassion might still linger. But Ito remained deaf to her pleas. Ruthlessly, he ended her life. After committing the terrible act, Ito retreated back into his ordinary, bleak existence. He returned to the warehouse where he worked, resuming his previous duties. He desperately tried to forget what he had done, but it was in vain. The nights became a torment. His conscience haunted him, and the horrifying images of his deed replayed endlessly in his nightmares. He saw her eyes, filled with terror, and heard her scream. The emotional suffering tormented him day after day. Finally, unable to bear the burden any longer, Ito broke. He went to the police station and surrendered to the authorities. The story of Kazuo Ito is a narrative of chilling malice, all-consuming hatred, and unbearable solitude. It is the story of a man crushed beneath the insurmountable weight of life's misfortunes. This is a story about how the seeds of evil take root in the soul, bearing terrible fruit. Yet this story also recounts the tragedy of Akira Kawamura, a young woman brimming with hope who found joy in every day. Akira became a victim of a monstrous crime, and her story is a bitter reminder of the need to be vigilant, to care for our neighbors, and to fight evil relentlessly. We must remember her so that her death is not in vain. But let us look at this tragedy from a different angle. Let us examine the social context surrounding this case. Japan, a country with one of the highest standards of living, and consequently, one of the lowest crime rates in the world. But even in this seemingly prosperous country, terrible things could and did happen. This case, like a painful jab, demonstrated that danger can lurk even in the safest corners, that problems can hide even in the most, at first glance, well-off families, that even the kindest and gentlest souls can fall victim to unimaginable cruelty. The public outcry was immense. The entire country, as if in a single wave, was shaken by this tragedy. People streamed into the streets to honor Akira's memory. They carried flowers and candles, their hearts filled with sorrow. They demanded justice, wanting the guilty to receive their due punishment. The media covered the case with utmost thoroughness. They recounted the investigation step by step, the long days of the trial, and the life of Akira, whose name was now known throughout the entire country. The pages of newspapers and television screens were filled with interviews with her grieving parents, devoted friends, and those who had taught her. But perhaps the most agonizing question that remained unanswered after the verdict was announced was this: what could have been done to avoid this tragedy? Could one have seen the first, barely perceptible signs of impending trouble in Ito's behavior? Was there a chance to offer him a helping hand before he crossed the line? The answers to these questions proved to be complex, filled with pain and doubt. But we are obliged to remember them. We must learn to recognize the warning signs that appear in people's behavior, especially those who might desperately need support. We must offer assistance to those in need, never remaining indifferent to another's misfortune. We are obligated to fight violence and hatred. It is our duty. I recall now how important a role the investigators played in this matter. Without sparing their strength, they, step by step, reconstructed the picture of the terrible event. Questioning witnesses, a careful analysis of the evidence, a meticulous comparison of facts, all of this demanded immense professionalism and dedication. Detective Takahashi, leading the investigative team, was renowned for his insight and persistence. He never shied away from challenging cases, and his team consistently achieved their objectives. In this investigation, he proved himself a true master of his craft, resting only when all the circumstances of the crime were completely revealed. He understood that behind this case lay not merely a murder, but a profound human tragedy. He knew that it was necessary not only to punish the perpetrator, but also to understand the reasons behind the event, in order to prevent the recurrence of such horrific events in the future. It was thanks to his efforts that undeniable evidence was discovered, which led the investigation to Kazuo Ito. It was his interrogations that helped break the criminal and force him to confess to his actions. Detective Takahashi and his devoted team made every effort to achieve justice for Akira and her family. One cannot ignore how the public reacted to this terrible case. An atmosphere of universal anger and deep sorrow reigned in the country. People were outraged by the inhuman cruelty of the crime, which chilled them to the bone, and demanded severe retribution for Ito. Heated debates erupted on social media and in the streets about the reasons for the event, what led to this terrible tragedy, and how to prevent such nightmares in the future. Numerous rallies and demonstrations were organized in support of the victims of violence, with thousands of people participating. Many wondered how this could have happened in peaceful and seemingly prosperous Japan, where tranquility and harmony had been valued for centuries. People sincerely sympathized with Akira's family, expressing their support in words and deeds. This tragedy, like nothing else, united Japanese society in a single impulse of grief and anger, showing that even in the darkest times, the light of hope and compassion could shine with renewed strength. It became a grim reminder of how fragile security is, how easily the usual order can be destroyed, and how important it is to be vigilant and care for each other. It is worth noting the role of the mass media in this story. Journalists, without closing their eyes, tried to convey to people a complete and objective picture of what was happening, from the investigation to the trial, and finally, to Akira's last days. The media played a huge role in shaping public opinion, supporting the family of the deceased and drawing attention to the problem of violence against women. But even after Ito's arrest and sentence to death, questions lingered, hanging heavy in the air. Did Ito have an accomplice? It was not impossible that he acted with someone, perhaps a partner, maybe even two others. Were there other victims in his past? Perhaps Akira was far from the first. What circumstances led Ito to become a killer? Many mysteries remained, their answers seemingly forever buried beneath a thick layer of secrecy. Why had he grown so cruel and embittered? This question seemed to drift unanswered, suspended in the atmosphere. And perhaps the truth would never fully come to light. But the most important thing is the memory of Akira. Her life, like a bright star, was cut short in the prime of her years. Her dreams, as bright and beautiful as she herself, remained unfulfilled, buried under the weight of tragedy. We are obliged to remember her. We must keep in our hearts the memories of her talent, her boundless kindness, her radiant smile that warmed everyone around her. We must remember her so as never to forget the fragility of human life, its vulnerability in the face of evil, and how important it is to fight it, sparing no effort. In conclusion, I would like to address you with one single question. What can we do to ensure that something like this never happens again, to prevent the repetition of these terrible tragedies? How can we make our world better, safer, and kinder? Perhaps there is no definitive answer to these questions, but we are obliged to continue seeking it, again and again, asking ourselves these complex questions. We must relentlessly fight against evil, whatever form it may take. We must remember Akira, her brief yet radiant life. May her death serve as a bitter reminder that we are all inextricably linked, like threads in a vast web, that we all bear responsibility for what unfolds in this world, for every word and every deed, and that we all, each and every one of us, must strive for justice, for peace, and of course, for love, that magnificent creative force